I am mining investor and editor of Resource Stock Digest, Gerardo Del Real, here today with a very special guest. Typically, we have my partner and mining investor, Mr. Nick Hodge, here. Today, we have Dr. Morgan Poliquin with us. We're going to talk about exploration, his PhD level background, the thesis that led to multiple discoveries, and why we're so excited. But before we get to all of that, this is the 319th episode of our weekly therapy session here that we like to call, Morgan, we call it Investing in Bizarro World. We're going to talk markets. We're going to talk exploration. Thank you so much for making time today. I couldn't be more excited to have you on. How are you, Morgan?
Oh, I'm wonderful. Thank you for inviting me. It's a great honor. I'd love to be here.
No, listen, it was kind of last minute. I figured I'd just shoot for the stars, and I couldn't be, again, more excited to have you on. Before we get into your background and your studies and your application of those studies to making multiple, in one case, a project that's worth over $1 billion in today's environment, I want to talk just the overall market. You are a big thinker. You are somebody that thinks about the world in broad strokes and have traveled all over the place. This gold environment. Now, I want to talk gold and then I want to talk copper, but I want to start with gold sitting firmly above 3,300. We have, government, seemingly not wanting to reduce the deficit, but add to it. And when I say seemingly, I'm being generous and kind here, right? We just had a big, beautiful bill that's an ugly, bloated bill to me. If you believe in mathematics and you believe in the idea that our currency is being devalued and the way that we're going to pay this down is by inflating the debt away. Regardless of what you believe, that's what the math says to me. And that bodes well for what you and I do, which is look for opportunities in the gold space, whether it's physical or deposits of gold or companies with exposure to gold. Where do you see the gold price in today's environment headed? And do you think it's sustainable here, given the state of the world and the state of the U.S. Economy and fiscal insolvency that we have and monetary insolvency that we have?
Well, it's a big question, but it's a simple question, really. I see that the biggest buyers of gold we all know are central banks right now, and the retail purchasing of gold is, I don't know if it's an all-time low, but the premiums on
Yeah.
coins, as far as I understand it, are very low. I mean, my dad tells me that in what was the year 1980 when gold had that peak in the 800s. There was one bank in Vancouver, Canada, where I am, Scotiabank, where you could buy gold, and people were lined up down the street, we don't see any of that. So I think central banks are buying gold because it's neutral. And
Mm.
I think the threat of what you might call default on government debt is substantial. So we're starting to see a war cycle develop in Europe. Nobody's talking about peace that I can see, which is a
No.
tragedy. And you're talking about capital flight, and I think the history of debt is that ultimately it gets defaulted upon, government debt. So we saw a lot of gold come out of Switzerland and London to the U.S. My understanding is it's private gold,
Right.
and physical tangible assets like gold don't feel safe in an environment where you could have capital
Mm.
controls, capital flight. So I think these central banks aren't buying gold because they think it's going to go up. It's just
Yeah.
a neutral asset, and it's obviously got this great history as being a way to manage reserves that aren't tied to somebody else's fiscal policies. So on the fiscal side, it's ugly. I mean, we it's really
I don't mean to
horrendous.
laugh. It's just, again, it's so just mathematically what it is, right?
It's a race to the bottom. I mean, you look at Japan and everyone says, well, it's okay because all the debt is owned domestically. Well, okay, but if you're going to go into a recession,
Yeah.
you're going to you're not going to domestically, you're going to have trouble servicing the debt. So, everything leads to call it printing money. There's no real exit here. There was great hope that perhaps that the deficit could be constrained, and we're seeing spending, like I think you alluded to, that all-time deficits. So I don't think this is resolvable politically.
Yeah.
So so in terms of gold, I only see good things, quite frankly.
As
I
far as
don't.
the price, not the situation that's going to lead to a higher price, is what I
I
assume
think the
that you're
purchasing
referencing,
power
right?
of gold, whatever the price is
Yeah.
just it's not going down as far as I can tell. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. Look, we have, however you feel about Elon Musk, he is, again, a big thinker, somebody that has had a lot of success, somebody that, has systems in place that can go get astronauts from outer space when NASA couldn't do it. And it took him all but 6 months to come in, be excited, say he was going to find 4 trillion in waste and areas to cut. And look, 6 months later, he said he's probably never donating to a political party again, and basically said, "Yeah, no, I don't know if this bill is big or beautiful, but I know it can't be both." Those were his exact words. So he went from Elon Musk is going to summon all his powers and his crack team of geniuses to find waste and fraud to they're not letting me do it. I am out of here. Let me go back to doing what they'll let me do, which is, try to electrify the world and try to get us into Mars. And again, however you feel about him, there is a part of me that feels a bit for him because he got to see very firsthand what our political process does to people that want to make change in regards to monetary and fiscal policy. And when we look at central banks and when we look at somebody like Elon, the bottom line is the access that Elon and the central banks have to the numbers and the data is access that nobody has, right? They get to see exactly what's behind the curtain. The fact that they are the people that are kind of sounding the alarm in their own way is a bit it's not scary, but definitely concerning, and not so much for the us's of the world, Morgan. I mean, we're asset owners, hard assets. We have access to capital markets. We're in an industry, frankly, that it behooves us for, geopolitical chaos and fiscal insolvency and monetary irresponsibility. That makes the things that, you search for and I invest in a lot more valuable in this cycle, which leads to equities being repriced and becoming a lot more valuable. But for the people that don't have access to capital markets and don't have, that worldview and have a traditional view that a 401k or social security is going to be the safety net that provides for them in 20 years or 30 years. I really feel for those people. So I say all that to say, folks, that gold is likely, in my opinion, headed higher. It's got a 5,000-year track record of purchasing power maintenance. I think that continues. That's a heck of a chart to argue against. How do you feel about silver?
Yeah, the American context for silver is really interesting because you have these. I think they're called the crimes of 18 something or other when there was bimetallism and the ratio was fixed. So there's a real cultural history there that's a little bit different. But obviously silver has an industrial use, which I think it actually makes it more exciting. To hold in some way, but it's the poor man's gold, and you know, if my understanding was when those horrible hurricanes and hit Carolina, those who didn't have cash were challenged. So physical, the ability to transact silver coins, I think, allow for that. It's got that Armageddon capacity to it, but it's also got a very long history as well. But back to gold, I'll tell you a story that gold has been very, I feel very good to my family, and the history of it is, I think, interesting. We are pretty sophisticated in the West, and I think we've forgotten about its attributes. My dad worked in Greece not long after, in the 60s, they had a civil war, and he employed some guys near the Bulgarian border as drillers on a gold project. They actually discovered the Skouries deposit, which is now, I think, a project in Eldorado Gold's portfolio. But they were drilling away and hiring some local guys who were wearing homespun clothing and had uh, never had a job really. And
Right.
the first thing that the income from employment um, that was noticeable change was clothing for the family, not homespun itchy clothing. And the next thing was a watch. And there's all these pictures my dad has of these guys with their watch and their clothing, and then all outside spending stopped. And my dad was, from the prairies in Canada, and the Canadian dollar was very strong in the 50s and 60s. We came out of the Second World War with huge manufacturing base, like a mini United States, actually.
Yeah. Yeah.
People forget that about Canada. Well, anyway, he asked them what they're doing, and because gold wasn't on his horizon, they said, "Well, come with us." My dad spoke Greek. They took him to I guess it was illegal for them to do, but they were buying British gold sovereigns on the black market. And my dad said, "Why are you doing that?" And they showed him, a great box of drachmas that had been, that were worthless. And so, a lot of people, all of these unsophisticated people around the world, seemingly unsophisticated, know a lot more than we do, actually. So and from that time, my dad really became interested in the subject, and I'm very lucky for that. So there's a long history there that we forget.
No, I love the story. For those of you not familiar, folks, I call Morgan my PhD friend. So him and his father were two of the first people I met in this business. I was introduced to you and your father by a friend and mentor and advisor to me, Mr. Jeff Phillips, and it was at a New Orleans investment conference. I want to say maybe 2009, at the most 2010, because it was before the Ixtaka discovery. And we'll talk about your history of discoveries and your father's history of discoveries. But you were two of the very first people that I ever met. And your father was kind enough to send me a book on geology. You were kind enough to always take my calls. And to this day, I tell everybody I pride myself on being a simple guy with simple ideas. And look, I may not have the PhD and I may not be a geologist, but I can call him pretty much anytime. So I want to say thank you and your father for the kindness that you've shown me over the years, because it's been substantial, and frankly, it's been very profitable. And I want to get into how I think we're going to make some good money in the cycle once again together with Almadex minerals, and we'll talk about that here in just a little bit.
Well,
So
thank you
no,
for that. That's very kind. But yeah, some people say that PhD stands for piled higher and deeper, so I wouldn't put too much into that.
well, listen, you were able to apply yours to make, some discoveries of some pretty substantial projects. And I do want to touch on that. But a part of the Almadex mineral story is this pivot. So let's start with your background, and then I want to talk Almadex, and I want to tie it into copper, which is what I wanted to talk about next. Because copper and gold to me are my two favorite commodities, followed by my third favorite commodity being uranium, which just had some big news. I talked about Trump's big, beautiful, ugly, bloated bill. Well, he actually had, some executive orders that I really liked, and I want to get into that in a bit too. But before we do that, let's talk about a bit about your background and how the heck you ended up in Mexico, and now why the heck you ended up in the Western US and this new concept that you have. A lot of questions there. I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, sure. Well, I was very fortunate to grow up my dad's field assistant, and there's I've uh, I'm 53, and when I turned 53 last summer, I was given a picture of me 50 years ago, standing on the drill at a deposit my dad found in Nevada called Santa Fe, and he was an out of the box thinker. He had a good exploration mentor called Albert Kaufman, who's a lot of people wouldn't know or think about, but Albert led a program with a young geologist, many young geologists, one of whom was my dad in northern Manitoba, and they found I think the number is 18 mines in 20 years,
It's
and
insane, folks. That's insane.
incredible. And so they had a systematic process based around some new technology, and they applied it regionally, and they took chances, meaning they systematically drilled things, recognizing that most holes were going to work out, most targets were going to work out. And so that approach, getting off the beaten path, is something that my dad did early on. That's how he found the Santa Fe deposit, which is his first venture on his own, and it was very successful. Homestake wound up mining it out. And my dad got into Mexico very early. He in the 70s he was down there looking at things with a company he worked for, and he saw that it was, you know, pretty dynamic, incredible place, geologically, and but there was challenging, investment criteria back then. I think you had to have a 51% Mexican partner, and there was different things. So when it opened up for foreign investment, 100% claim ownership in 1992, I believe, he got back in there, and I joined him shortly after. I became kind of interweaving the storylines here. I became really interested in um, uh, what is known as epithermal deposits in
Yeah.
particular. And there's sort of two types of epithermal deposits, and that was being elucidated and studied. And one of the places where that was really being worked on in terms of processes and what forms gold and how was in New Zealand. And I identified that. So basically the hot springs there that everyone might be familiar with in New Zealand are being exploited for geothermal power. So they've
Hmm.
drilled 3-kilometer wells, like oil type wells, into these boiling hot springs and extracting fluid before it's boiled and bringing it up under pressure to surface and then releasing the pressure, and that drives turbines. And New Zealand's way off in the middle of nowhere with not a huge amount of hydro power, and they decided they don't want nuclear. So they've gone that way. And as a consequence, the study of these things allows you to determine the processes that are resulting in the deposition of gold. So you actually tie minerals together with gold. And so, therefore, minerals that are forming away from where the gold is depositing are just as important as the minerals that are
Hmm.
forming with the gold because you can be predictive. And so that was a living laboratory, and I did my master's down there in the mid '90s, and there was only at the time a couple of North Americans who'd gone down there, pretty famous in the epithermal literature, and so I was really lucky to have that experience. And I studied a gold mine in Fiji, which played a role in my Mexican experience because it was associated with these fairly I wouldn't say they're that unusual, but high potassium volcanic rocks. And I started looking, well, where are high potassium volcanic rocks elsewhere? Um, and I found an area in eastern Mexico where there was high potassium volcanic rocks.
Yeah.
And I drove out there with my dad in 1995, and in the Pan American Highway on the coast
Yep.
in Veracruz, we found an alteration zone, and there was gold sticking out of the highway. And that precipitated started the journey of trying to understand what's going on in eastern Mexico and why that was there. And it led to 3 discoveries. And so, uh, we grew this exploration concept out of really just an idea like that. And we got BHP, a big company, to support us, which involved me getting in a helicopter and flying from the Texas border over a period of many years, incrementally to the Guatemala border, landing on thousands of things. And
Didn't you
basically,
also do that during your honeymoon, Morgan? Do I
oh,
recall that correctly?
yeah, there's a funny story there. So, I had, gone on a tour in university of hot springs in Northern California,
Yeah.
and, there are some cool hot springs in, um, north of San Francisco, north of the Napa Valley. Um, what's that? There's a lake. Is it Clear Lake? The Clear Lakes? I think so. Anyway, it's a beautiful part of California. And so, yeah, my wife and I, we decided when, she was okay with it, is going and hitting, these hot springs. Some of them are really gnarly, where you gotta hike up to them, and other ones are more developed in the Napa Valley, and just hitting all these different hot springs. That was our honeymoon.
I love that. And I didn't mean to cut into your story, but I had to add that in there. True geologist, folks. And so back to your experience in Mexico and Eastern Mexico and how you tied in this concept and that led to multiple discoveries, several of which I've been to.
Yeah, I mean, basically, nobody really, in terms of the geologic literature, why these things were where they were, what age they were, how they formed, when they formed, was really poorly understood. And we had another project I identified in northern Mexico in a state called Coahuila State, and I didn't understand, that was a copper gold uh, system, and there was this one in Veracruz I was describing, And are they related? They're on the east side. And so basically, out of all the work that I did, I wound up being able to publish it as a PhD. But it was my exploration work, and basically what it came up with is there was two episodes where I'm sure everyone's familiar with subduction, um, and where one plate goes under another, and that
Yeah.
causes volcanoes. Well, the one plate going under another, it's not always just perfectly symmetrical because, what if you were to subduct something like a Hawaii, a big lump on the plate, like an island? And what if the island was sort of a line of islands that wasn't perpendicular to the subduction zone? It was like, so you get all these mechanical things that happen, like torsion and tears. I don't know if that makes any sense, but basically, um, the angle of the subducting slab uh, will determine, what happens. So as this slab goes up and down, you get these things called windows, which are periods of time where the right kind of magma can suddenly squirt up. And so if you know the age of that and you know the mechanical reasons behind it, you can be predictive about where these little windows are going to open up. And so that's basically the map I put together. And I found out there was two time periods where that happened, where these really great type of magmas, came up and that are capable of producing these copper gold deposits. So once you have that model together, then it's just like, okay, let's extrapolate, interpolate, let's just go along this trend and use this age and this timing to go look for other areas. And once you do that, then you can bring in all kinds of other tools and you start to find stuff. It just certainly, it's not to say that these things, the odds of any one thing being a mine is, I'm sure your
Yeah.
listeners know are very long, but it just kind of all of a sudden just falls in your lap like this. The concept creates a whole bunch of these targets really quickly once you have the right criteria. So that was the experience, and it was a really successful exploration program. We made three discoveries, and I think we're on the cusp of making a bunch more with that knowledge. But things changed. In in Mexico, there was a new administration that put a moratorium on new claim staking,
Yep.
and that, to my knowledge, hasn't changed. So it made generative exploration virtually impossible. And gradually things became more challenging in Mexico for even projects that were developed and so on.
Yeah.
So a couple of years ago, I think is where you're going, is I
Yep.
decided to actually, in the middle of all of that, I thought, wait a second, there's these high sulfidation epithermal things in Nevada. One of which, this is a really weird story, my dad found was the Santa Fe deposit.
Huh.
So Santa Fe, it was one of these things, a porphyry lithocap, which we can probably define and talk about. And
Yep.
so halfway through this program in Mexico, uh, I thought, well, let's go chase that up. And so uh, I started looking at it. I think it was 2007, 2008, and then we had the global financial crisis, and then in
Yeah.
2010 we made our Extaca discovery and became very
Yep.
focused on that. So it's only now that I'm coming back to this, the last 2 or 3 years, and putting this, what we're doing now together.
Well, let's talk about what you've put together, right? And obviously, in exchange for your time, a shameless plug for Almadex Minerals, folks. Because look, you own your own rigs. I think. What are you up to now? 7 rigs?
Oh, we've got 6. We've got 6
6.
rigs.
So,
Yep.
you're up to 6 rigs. You're cashed up. You just received or are about to receive payment from a gold loan from a sister company. So I think you're in excess of what, 15, $16 million, including that gold loan in cash, give or take.
Yeah, I mean, we're just about to put out our new, financials, obviously, this time of year, and we've got, you know, if knock on wood, that all settles because it depends
Yeah.
on finishing this sale of some equipment. But yeah, I think that would put us, it'd be a very healthy cash balance, as you say, and it allows us to do a heck of a lot of drilling, which is the idea. So just we can talk about the details, but just for me, you know, I mentioned Albert Kaufman, that concept of putting together a whole bunch of ideas in a new terrain with a new concept, and then combining that with systematically doing early stage drilling. uh, that's the combination of things you need to make a discovery, in my view. So, I think that's what's really exciting about where we're at is we've been working really hard and quietly, and um, it's not very exciting to do generative work to your the market and your shareholders. Our shareholders are wonderful, and I think understood that we have done these things before, and markets weren't good either, so luckily it was a good time to be generating things, and we were able to this I really believe this concept that we followed up has paid, in terms of generative work. We've been able to find the projects we were hoping to find, and now it's a question of seeing what's there and drilling them.
So before we talk about what comes next on that front, how many projects are you up to? And I have to ask you because this ties back to my copper outlook, which everybody here knows I'm a huge copper bull. I think we're going to see 6, 7, maybe $8 copper here in the next several years. If I'm halfway right now, we get to a 6, we're going to do very, very, very well, right? But you traditionally have been very precious metal centric and focused. It was interesting to me when I heard you get excited about copper gold porphyries, because it was the first time really, though you had made, copper gold discoveries in the past. I hadn't really heard you be as excited about these copper gold projects to the degree that you are now. So how many of these have you put together and why copper? Share your views on copper for us, please,
Well, we got
Morgan.
about a dozen projects in the Western US. Not all of them are copper gold. I don't know the exact breakdown. We've got some other ones that are more precious metal ones, but yeah, we've got just off the top of my head here, without adding them up, we've got about half a dozen that are real porphyry targets that are kind of approaching drill ready or are drill ready. So uh, yeah, I mean, copper porphyries are uh, one of the largest metal endowments by deposit type. Uh, if you look at distribution of size, epithermal veins, most of them are really small and some of them are real outliers. Porphyries are all really large. Once you're over a certain threshold, they're big, low grade deposits. I think now a quarter of the world's gold production comes from
Yeah.
them, and, I'm not sure, but 70%, I think, of the world's copper comes from them, and if I'm not mistaken, virtually all of the world's molybdenum. So, they're tremendous resources, and, uh I don't know, I kinda like weird metaphors, but, in 1971, the year I was born, was the first hijacking of an airplane, and the next
Huh.
year there was 200 hijackings. Everyone was
Holy
doing it.
smokes.
It's like and it's the same with copper porphyries. Once the geology was understood, there was 10,000 found around the world in a space of a couple of years. And so, most
Hmm.
of these things, the approach was to mine them from big open pits, and, you can imagine in the '70s, these programs of going around the world and doing stream sediments and finding them in the most exotic and challenging locales like, equatorial Indonesia, where you got glaciers at the equator. Is Grasberg
Yeah.
one of, Freeport's, big deposits. So, there's not a lot of, porphyries that are gonna be found sticking out of the ground. Um,
Yeah.
and so porphyries form these huge things called lithocaps, which are these big alteration zones that are where the magma that formed the porphyry, the fluids, enormous amount of fluids come off of these magmas with copper and gold in them. And the copper and gold drop out, but the fluids can carry on, or earlier stage fluids don't have copper gold in them. And they go up and they affect, we call it alteration, receptive rocks over huge areas and change those reactive rocks into, let's call it clay. There's a whole bunch of minerals.
Yeah.
And so you get these piles of clay, and they can be totally barren. Like, for example, one of the greatest discoveries no one's ever heard of was made by Vale, the big Brazilian company. And they
Yep.
had a team led by some Canadian guys that ran around and found this amazing thing called Onto, ONTO, and people can go and look at it on YouTube. And these guys drilled through pretty much barren clay, call it, and 700 meters down hit, I don't know, is it 3 billion tons? I'll misquote it, but it's like 1% gold, 1 gram, or what, 1% copper, 1 gram gold. And it's huge.
Hmm.
And so these discoveries under these piles of clay are where the next discoveries of copper and gold are going to be made. And rather than going to Indonesia or 5,000 meters in the Andes, I think the best place to do it is in the continental United States. And so my belief is that the high sulfidation gold systems, which form above or adjacent to copper gold porphyries, necessarily are associated with porphyries. They are formed from a porphyry environment. If you find those, then you look underneath those, or you find alteration zones that are along a trend that are the same, and you look underneath. And so the nice thing about it is that that's what we're doing, is that you're automatically put yourself in the position to find a porphyry because you've got the right minerals that are only forming above a porphyry. There's a suite of them, and we can identify them. And so once we know that tectonic situation, which is permissive to form them, and then we find a pile of clay, and we're like, well, this pile of clay is associated with a porphyry.
Yeah.
It may be too deep, it may be too low grade, it may be faulted off, there's so many geological, things that might happen, so you don't know, but you're dealing with a porphyry, which is like one of these large metal endowments, so you've
Yeah.
narrowed yourself down to putting yourself if you do hit, you're gonna hit it out of the park kind of a thing,
Yep.
and of
Yep.
course, our odds of hitting are always very long, but at least you're putting yourself in the right spot, to find a porphyry right from the get-go.
No, well, look, I think you positioned shareholders beautifully for this discovery cycle. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I don't think you'd be looking at copper, gold, porphyries if you thought copper was going back to $1 and not going higher, right? Supply demand fundamentals, hence the shirt, scream higher copper prices, and I think we have. An environment for the next couple of years that's going to be really, really, really exciting for companies that make, the kind of discoveries that are becoming less and less frequent, and I think there's going to be a huge premium for companies that make them in top-notch jurisdictions that are safe. The country that my parents are from and that's near and dear to my heart, Mexico, unfortunately has a great, great track record of getting in its own way, right? It's geologically permissive. It's beautiful. The culture is amazing. The food's amazing. The people, the whole thing. And it's just a perfect, pitch perfect example of how government can self-sabotage a nation's development. And so and I'm going to tie this a bit into the uranium conversation that I want to have, but I hope that, at the very least on the permitting side, that we're starting to make some advances. We saw the Stibnite project in Idaho finally get its permit after nearly a decade. We saw executive orders from the Trump administration ordering the Department of Energy to expand uranium conversion and enrichment capabilities. They want to restart, complete, and build new nuclear plants to the tune of 10 by 2030. So, they want to increase the production in the reserves here to a number that's going to be substantial to the uranium price. So I say all that to say, before we get back to Almadex, I think gold goes higher. I think copper goes higher. I think uranium goes higher. I don't know if you have any thoughts on uranium or the permitting process here in the U.S., or how easy it has been to work in the U.S. relative to your experience in Mexico, which of course did not end in the most positive or constructive of ways.
Yeah, well, commodities are hard to find, are hard to develop, and now we have something going on in the world that we haven't seen since the early '90s, which is a bifurcation of the world again into
Yeah.
Eastern influence and U.S. influence. I've been watching with great interest. Somebody I know is working on a copper project in the DRC, and the United States
Hmm.
government has made, I guess, agreements with the DRC to help develop those strategic resources. And so what I see is that country by country, region by region, we're in a scramble for resources, and quite frankly, I believe that the the most resource-rich continent is North America.
Yeah.
Um, as a Canadian, that loves the US and has spent, a lot of my life working in the US, I think we ought to have very close ties together, and I would include Mexico in that. I love Mexico and, people of Mexico, and if we were able to have an understanding together, for mutual benefit, which I think would be very easy to do, I think, and is logical, um, the resources are there, but the supply chains are broken since COVID, and
Yeah.
the geopolitical, um challenges that we're seeing are I don't think they're gonna get better. I think the trend is your friend. I'm a long-term optimist for the human race, but in the short term, I really see the potential. I hate to say it even, to articulate it because I have children. My oldest is 15, but, I see the potential for war in the near term. And interest rates always go up in war, and critical minerals sadly are used for things that they shouldn't be used for, like weaponry and
Yeah.
whatnot. Uh, you know, uh, uh, but supply chains being broken. Obviously in a recession, which it seems we're globally going to go into, demand can go down. Um, but that I don't see happening, in terms of I'm sure demand will go down, but I don't see it affecting my personal view is I don't see how it affects the copper price,
Yeah.
by virtue of the fact that we're losing our supply chain,
Yep.
and domestic production is gonna be held at a premium. Everyone every country now is sort of, whatever they had to say about mining in the past are now
Yeah. It's a whole new
re-articulating.
day. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Look, I want to get to so we have a premium portion of this podcast, so I definitely want to get to that. I want to thank our guest, Dr. Morgan Poliquin, for coming on. I am Gerardo Del Real. This was the 319th episode of our weekly therapy session we call Investing in Bizarro World. Have a great week out there, everyone. Take care.